certificates.
Presented to Ella Luckman for completing all her work even though she had a very sore thumb, Mrs. Friend. Presented to Zach Laidley for working really hard to understand the concept of perimeter and area. Well done, Zach, Mrs. Vilkin. Presented to Jared Swan for always using his initiative by tidying and organising the classroom without being asked, Mrs. Elkington. Presented to Ben Gallichan for a fantastic attitude to his classwork. You are always so enthusiastic, Ben. What a star, Mrs. Weller. Presented to Abigail Kilmurray for the amazing effort she puts into solving her maths problems. Clever girl, Abby, Mrs. Eckert. Presented to Jamie Dalwood for his excellent efforts in the class to finish all his work quickly and quietly, Mrs. Friend. Presented to Tyson Lever for showing organisation skills when he took a group to play scaredy cat. Wow, Mrs. Galley and Mrs. Nichols. Presented to Errol McCoy for his fantastic leadership skills in our Grand Pix Technology Challenge, Mrs. Friend. Presented to Tanisha Bub for looking after others in her class by her wonderful acts of service. Thank you, Mrs. Galley and Mrs. Nichols. Presented to Anna Snassa for always working to the best of her personal best, working quietly and independently to get the work done, Mrs. Elkington. Presented to Nikita Weary for working very hard to complete all your tasks on time. Keep up the great work, Mrs. Wilkin. Presented to Nevin Lloyd for showing confidence during math sessions and participating in more class discussions, Mrs. Elkington. Presented to Jared Hall for showing amazing persistence when solving maths problems. Keep it up, Mrs. Pincock. Presented to Abraham Abu for his great work writing a receipt for pizza in class. Well done, Mrs. Peacock. Presented to Montana De Corderio for your increased confidence and persistence in maths. Great work, Montana, Mrs. Peacock. Presented to Marta Ramatu for being so persistent with his maths. Great answers and results, Marta. Keep up the counting, Mrs. Eckert. Presented to Graham Neal for settling down in his new classroom in school. Well done, Brayden, Mrs. Eckert. Presented to Jacob Watson for the huge effort he puts into all his work. Great focusing, Jacob, Mrs. Eckert. Presented to Noah McKeon Rhodes for always being a happy class member who always tries his best at everything he does, Mrs. Nichols. Presented to Amber Jane Simone for being such an enthusiastic class member who always tries very hard to get along with everyone, Mrs. Nichols. Presented to Bailey Peaches for constantly being on task and doing her best work, Mrs. Marshall and Mrs. Carway. Presented to Tyler Pons for putting a fantastic effort into his handwriting for the letter C, Mrs. Marshall and Mrs. Carway. Presented to Swan Yu for showing confidence when writing a sentence. Great listening to all the sounds in the word swam. Well done, Mrs. Weller. Danny Malaya for always completing his homework to a high standard. No wonder you have learned all the sounds, Danny. What a star, Mrs. Weller. Presented to Sophie Jakeway for the fantastic results she achieved in her spelling and dictation test. Huge effort, Sophie, Mrs. Effort. Presented to Finn and Eva for his outstanding work on maths activities. Well done, Finn, Mrs. Luna. Presented to Angel Dillon for the improved effort she is making to remain on task and complete her work, Mrs. Luna. Presented to Nate Rhodes for working well during spelling time to learn your list words. Well done, Nate, Mrs. Luna. Presented to Jasmine Buckle for constantly behaving as a responsible class member, Mrs. Morgan. Please give these students a round of applause.